Welcome to Season 3 of Conversations on Modern Slavery. My name is Bryon Lippincott. I'm the head of communications for Free the Slaves and co-host this podcast with my colleague, Dr. Marta Furlan, the senior program manager for research at Free the Slaves. Conversations on Modern Slavery takes you inside the global fight to end modern slavery. Each episode features engaging conversations with researchers, leaders, frontline advocates, and policy experts, diving into root causes, current challenges, and bold solutions driving change. Whether you're new to the issue or deeply involved in the work, this podcast offers fresh insights and powerful stories to inform, inspire, and mobilize. Today, we're discussing the recently released guide on ethical anti-trafficking practices for faith-based organizations. My guests today are part of the community that came together to produce this guide. Joining me today are Angela, a modern slavery and human trafficking resource coordinator for the Salvation Army in Indonesia, Dalaina, the executive director of Bali Indonesia, which is the secretariat holder of the Global Learning Community, Andrea Baker from Project SUMA in Bolivia, and Dr. Marta Furlan, the senior program manager for research at Free the Slaves. Before we get into the deeper conversation, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Angela, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you, Bryon. My name is Angela Pontororing, and I'm based in Indonesia, working for the Salvation Army. Happy to join this podcast. Thank you.
Andrea.
Hi, I'm here in Bolivia. I'm glad to be with you guys. Been working with victims of sexual violence and exploitation for over 20 years here with Project SUMA. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Andrea. Dalaina?
Yeah, hey there. Excited to be here and to talk to all of you guys today. My name's Dalaina May, and I'm executive director of Bali, like you said. We're a coalition organization in Indonesia with about 80 organizations across the country that we support with training and resourcing, and also holding the secretariat of the Global Learning Community, which is kind of similar. It's a big network of anti-trafficking practitioners. I think we're at around 270 members from 60-something countries and growing very fast. So I get to spend a lot of my time talking to really cool people doing really cool stuff.
Sounds amazing. Marta?
Yes, thank you, Bryon, for the introduction and for hosting us on this episode. My name is Marta. I work with Bryon at Free the Slaves, where I'm managing the research projects of the organization to guide our policy, advocacy, and programming. And I'm very excited of being here with Angela, Andrea, and Dalaina to talk about these guidelines.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for those good introductions. I think I'd like to start today with the origins of the project. How was the idea for developing these guidelines initiated or born?
Well, I'm happy to take that one. It started quite a while back in 2023. The Global Learning Community hosts monthly learning calls, and they're on a variety of different topics. And we had one scheduled toward the end of 2023 with Dr. Emma Tomlin from the University of Leeds. She'd done some research on faith-based organizations working in anti-trafficking, and the GLC does have a number of faith-based organizations, and even if you're not one, you probably work with one. So we ended up hosting her for our monthly learning call, which was just a fabulous call, and there was a lot of interest in kind of continuing the conversation. So we held another call. We call them coffee corner calls because they're just kind of unscripted conversation dialogues. And out of that conversation, there was just, a real felt need for something like this. And so we ended up with 13 people from 11 organizations in 9 countries that ended up deciding to form a working group to develop the guidelines together. And it took us about a year, most of 2024. We worked together to produce it.
Okay, thank you. That's a great explanation to start. I guess my follow-up question to that would be, for the other people who participated in this group, what inspired you to join this process and participate in this process?
I think for me, it's like I'm part of the GLC community, so I regularly join their calls and their monthly meetings. And when I saw this call being advertised by Dalaina and the other colleagues at the GLC, I thought it was very interesting. In one of my previous research projects, I was working on the role that religious leaders play in the promotion of human rights, or the role that they play in countering and going against human rights protection. So I find that the role of religious leaders is a very interesting one to explore, and I felt that in the human trafficking space there is still a lot of questions that could be addressed in terms of how can we better work with religious leaders, faith-based organizations to advance our fight against human trafficking. So I was very interested in being part of this collaborative work and think together of ways in which we can strengthen the partnerships with the FBOs, religious leaders, to work towards the goal of ending modern slavery and human trafficking.
Okay. Angela or Andrea?
Yeah, for us in Bolivia, we are a faith-based organization. And I think over the years, there's been confusion, frustration, mistakes made. And so that's why I wanted to be a part of this, because we want to do this better.
For me, it started when in 2013, not 2013, sorry, 2023, we had survivor leader from our organization doing survey for survivor about their experience in aftercare in Southeast Asia, and then 2024 in Europe. And it comes to our attention that spiritual care can help in their healing. But then also the subject is very sensitive, that if you do it wrong, it can actually hinder their healing process. And learning from that survey and learning from GLC that they're doing this, I was like, I have to jump on and join this effort, and to learn how to do it right, I think.
Okay. Thank you. That's very interesting. I guess as I think about, it seems like this probably was a bit of a challenging process. Like the faith-based perspectives, there's a wide variety of things that fall under faith-based perspective, whether it's different religions or different worldviews, a lot of aspects that can come into that. So what was the process for developing these guidelines? How did you go about creating this? It's a very diverse group of people. What was that process like?
Lots of conversations, I guess, to start with. And you're right, we had, diverse perspectives in terms of beliefs and certainly cultural perspectives and backgrounds. And it was actually really helpful, I think. It was helpful that we all kind of know each other, at least on some level, through the global learning community. So there was, some relationship kind of established on some level. But, people kind of bringing different, like, oh, well, my context, like I'm working with really conservative Christians. And so like, if this is going to be accessible to them, what do we need to do? And then we have, like a resident atheist who's like, okay, but what about this? And so like, there was definitely like some tension and sharing. There was a lot of sharing stories, like things that we've seen and we've experienced, stories we've heard from people with lived experience. What are we trying to address? And so we spent a lot of time, I think, before we even really, I think, wrote a single word, just talking about what we were trying to accomplish and who we were trying to talk to. And then, practically speaking, we met. It ended up being helpful to meet in like 2-3 hour blocks every couple of months, rather than just trying to like do a little bit at a time. But yeah, lots of talking and lots of sharing experiences and trying to make it as inclusive as possible.
I appreciated like you're talking about the diversity, but like there was so much knowledge and experience, and also respect and a desire to honor everybody involved. So I thought that was really beneficial and beautiful.
Yeah, and I think like in these collaborative projects, one of the challenges maybe that, especially when they are so extensive over time, as Dalaina said at the beginning, it took about 1 year from the moment we started until the moment the guidelines were released to keep continuity and to keep engagement. But I think all the people that were part of this group were very committed from the beginning until the very end. And this proved to be very helpful to keep the process going, to make progress throughout it, and to make sure that the group remained cohesive and collaborative as it was from the beginning. And I think we worked, as Dalaina and Andrea said, like it was a step after step process. So we started with a lot of conversations, just sharing thoughts, questions, answers on the whole. Why do we need to do this, and what are we trying to achieve by doing this? Then we started to put down our thoughts in a conceptual map that was capturing our initial considerations, and from that it developed into a document that eventually became the report that you can now see and read.
Definitely. I also like the we not only taking the time to meet monthly, but also we reach out to various survivor leaders in in our own organization and outside of our organization to get their feedback on the draft of the guidelines first before we finalize that, so we have their perspective within the guidelines.
Okay. Thank you for sharing all that. It sounds like a really interesting and collaborative process. I would love to have been able to participate in that. I don't have the time, but it sounds like a really fulfilling process. So I guess that leads to my next question, which is, who are the guidelines for? If it's for faith-based organizations, how do we define that? Who does this document theoretically apply to? Who is it targeting? How do you see that working?
I think, obviously, as you said, Bryon, this is addressed to faith-based organizations working in the anti-trafficking movement, that are working with the survivors of anti-trafficking on reintegration, rehabilitation. But it is also addressed to organizations that are not faith-based, but that they do work, or they are interested in working with faith-based organizations, so that this document can help them to be more aware of the complexities that surround working with this kind of organizations. And it can be helpful for them in terms of selecting partners or collaborating more efficiently and more ethically, especially with partners that are faith-based.
Yeah, and even hearing, as we've kind of rolled it out, hearing different organizations, how they're wanting to use it. For some, it's, hey, we want to really look at our policies and make sure we're aligning with leading practices in the sector. Others, talking to some folks in Europe, they've expressed sometimes when they're trying to look for like government partners, there's kind of some skepticism because they're a faith-based organization. And so to have something that kind of says, look, here's where we are ethically on some of these things that, might be a little questionable, where people are going to be, well, are you doing this or that? Like, we can just say definitively, like, this is our policy around how we handle our, faith perspectives or faith values in terms of our programming and our work. And so, I think definitely, can be used in different ways by faith-based organizations. And definitely, as Marta said, my organization's not faith-based, and we've had good experiences with faith-based partners and really bad experiences with faith-based partners. And so, for me, just on the ground, it's really helpful to have something before I'm going to sign an MOU with somebody, to do a project together, to have something really simple that's, doesn't come from me, but comes from kind of like a community of practitioners. Is like, look, this is kind of expectations for healthy practices as a faith-based organization. Is this something that, you're comfortable with, that you can say, yes, this is how we practice our work, before I kind of, join forces on a project or something like that. Kind of gives me a little bit of a gauge to know where they fall on different perspectives, because faith-based organizations, like you said, are very, very wide, very, very diverse, with, some that are real sketchy and some that are fantastic. And sometimes it's really hard to know before you develop a relationship with them. So it's kind of a vetting type of thing as well.
And on the other side, we've had a number of people ask us how we share our faith. Is that a priority? Is it important? And so this guideline is really helpful for us to say, yes, it is. And honoring the person and honoring their journey is also really important. And so how we share our faith is based in this document, everybody's invited to the table, but nobody's pressured and manipulated in a way that would be even more harmful.
Yeah, I think it's also good for communicating with your funder. Sometimes we have funding from government when, like Dalaina said, they are quite self-skeptical working with faith-based organization, but also sometimes we have funding from faith organization that this document can be used to set the standard of, like Dalaina said, like, this is how we work. And if you have any expectation that we will prioritize faith sharing in an ethical way, so just to set the expectation that we won't delve into that area. Thank you.
And a final point that maybe I would like to make on this point is that we deliberately built these guidelines having in mind not one single faith, but thinking of making them relevant as much as possible across faith, across worldviews, across beliefs, so that any organization that is faith-based in any part of the world, subscribing to any faith or belief, could relate to these guidelines and could use them as a reference for their work.
Okay, I'm going to reorder my questions just slightly because you have already verged into another question, and that's totally fine. But I'll try and keep content together here so we're all kind of, the flow is good for the audience. So the question that we've kind of verged into is, how did you envision the guidelines being used? So I hear partnership, informing how people see the world in terms of creating partnerships, communicating values to different stakeholders, whether it be governments or survivors or different things like that. I'm curious if there's other aspects of how this document is constructed that help inform other parts of practice. For example, monitoring and evaluation, reporting to, like boards of directors or to funders, some of those other things in terms of how does the ethics guide inform those processes, or the development of, monitoring evaluation guidelines, communication strategies, all of those things. Does this document speak to some of those things as well?
We would use this primarily for training our staff. How do we share our faith? Do we share our faith? And then go from there. And then also just speaking to our partners, non-faith-based and faith-based groups that walk with us. But like for policy development, like Dalaina said, that's mainly how we would use this document.
One of the decisions that we made for kind of the creation of this was to keep it as brief as possible. I think it's like a total of 21 pages with a lot of white space. So like it's something you could sit down with over lunch and finish. So the idea was to give an overview of like, here's the main points. You need to be thinking through these different things, but not necessarily spelling out how, again, because we want it to be relevant across lots of different kinds of organizations, a lot of different cultures, so it's not just, Christian faith-based aftercare, like, or something like that. Like, it should be applied really, really broadly. And I mean, and honestly, like, even though they're targeted to faith-based organizations, I can look through this as a non-faith-based organization and be like, yep, check, 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 check. Like, I can get behind all of this. These are just good principles for any practitioner, any organization. But the difference is we really wanted to honor the fact that, I think Angela said earlier, spirituality is a huge part of healing for a lot of people. We know that there's data around that. And we want to honor that fact, honor the reality that lots and lots of people around the world, practitioners and people with lived experience both, are religious, and feeling like we want to be able to make sure that gets integrated, that doesn't get left out of the conversation around anti-trafficking work and aftercare and things like that. And so I feel like it's really good principles in general, but kind of just tailored toward, okay, how do we weave in the reality of a need for spiritual healing, or a spiritual component to healing for a lot of people, and the reality that a lot of people are coming from a faith perspective and are trying to figure out how to integrate that into their practice.
Marta,
Yeah.
Angela, anything to add to that?
Yes, and I think although we try to make it very brief, we also cover a lot of topics. So we also touch into ethical storytelling. You mentioned about reporting and monitoring evaluation. So we discuss, and we have that integrated within our the guiding principles, to make sure that not only like our practices with survivor are ethical, but also how we communicate and share their story for fundraising purposes and reporting purposes is also aligned with their values, and in a dignifying manners.
Okay, so now that we've talked about all of these, like the process and the application of it, I'm very curious, what are some of these guidelines? How, like, can you provide some examples, highlights of the key parts of this document, the key principles?
Sure. We have 9. So, I feel like you probably could have done a bazillion, but we really tried to kind of bring it under 9 big umbrellas, I guess. And, each guideline recommendation is kind of like, here's the thing, and then we have bullet points underneath it. So, maybe I'll just grab number 1 and then just tell you what it is, tell you what the bullet points are, and so you can kind of understand the layout, I guess. So our first guideline is respect religious freedom, diversity, and choice. And so the subpoints underneath that: uphold human dignity in all aspects of care, empower survivors to make free and informed choices, honor different beliefs and practices, recognize and prevent spiritual abuse, avoid unethical proselytization. And then each of those kind of subpoints has a paragraph and a conversation, kind of conversation around that, including a glossary, what is spiritual abuse, for people that maybe don't even know that term, with some links where they could find some more information. And so, each of the points is kind of a major heading and subpoints, I think mostly designed to get people thinking like, oh, is my organization, practicing unethical proselytization? What does that look like? What does that mean? So it's like, don't do this, here's the thing, or do this, here's a definition. And then hopefully from there, people can kind of jump off and, discuss what does that look like in our context.
And another one that perhaps it's worth discussing here is the one number 9, that applies specifically to faith-based organizations that are working with children. So here we were reflecting on what specific considerations have to be taken into account when the survivors that are being engaged are minors. And some of the bullet points that are brought out here are child-specific trauma-informed care to ensure that care and support are age-appropriate, trauma-informed, and child-centered, parental and guardian engagement, so engage with the parents or the guardians of the children in ways that support the child healing and recovery process, child participation, encouraging and supporting children's participation in decisions that are about their own care and their own recovery process, respecting their voice and their autonomy. And finally, voluntary participation in religious activities. So even when we're talking about children, participation in religious practices always should remain voluntary for children as much as it is for adults.
For me, I want to highlight the guiding principles number 3, prevent re-traumatization through sensitive use of faith language and practices. And under this topic, there's 2 bullet points, which is the first, the sensitive spiritual messaging, recognizing like spiritual healing is important for a survivor, but also there are survivor or modern slavery that got into their exploitation because of religious activities or religious leaders. So being more sensitive in that. And also the second bullet point is voluntary participation in religious activities, highlighting that it is in the hand of the survivor to decide whether they want to engage in religious activities and not in the hand of organization.
Okay. Anything else, Andrea? Anything to add?
No, not right now.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for some of those highlights. I think those all sound really important, and it's interesting. The word voluntary keeps coming up, and having read a lot of research on anti-trafficking practices, it's something that you come up against quite often in research with survivors, is that there's often aspects of recovery, reintegration, where their ability to have agency is often not honored. With some organizations it is, some organizations, but that constraint often comes up. So I think it's interesting and notable that that's embedded in multiple of these principles.
I mean, it's even in the document talking about, we're coming from a survivor-centered perspective, where, like you said, I think one of the things that we've gotten wrong over the years as a sector is taking unnecessary control over people for whom, like, the whole issue is that they lost control of their lives. And, we kind of continue that form of exploitation sometimes in our practices in attempts to help them. And so, a survivor-centered perspective really does put the person in charge of their own healing, and not just the pace, but the how, and deciding what it is they need. And so really trying to encourage organizations to think through their programs and practices and projects, are your beneficiaries the ones that are actually setting the tone, setting the pace, making decisions? Is it individualized, or is it just cookie cutter? That's a big issue where you try to siphon everybody into the same program, same system, same rate of recovery or whatever. And we know it doesn't work. And so I think this is just another way to apply that, to our practices as faith organizations, and just to faith in general for people with lived experience. Like Angela said, I have personal friends who are people with lived experience for whom some of the most traumatizing aspects of their experience was religious. And so for them, if they were in a program where they were being forced to participate in religious activities, it would be incredibly damaging. And just being sensitive to, every person's story is so different. Every survivor's experience is so different. And so in a lot of ways, like, their recovery needs to be very individualized as well. And that includes in spirituality and religion.
Okay. Well, I think this is actually a really good transition into the next question, which is, why was there a need for this type of guidelines, for this type of document? Not to get into all the dirt and all of the the horror stories that exist out there, but I mean, it is fair to have a conversation about, what problems drive this need across the sector.
I think in our context, we have, we have some groups and some people who are very enthusiastic about sharing their faith. And then we have others who have been hurt, by religious groups. And so are even cautious of, do I want to align myself with this organization or not? I don't know. We've just had lots of confusion, honestly, about how do we honor people, and how do we share a faith that could provide hope and comfort. I mean, we've had so many incidences where things just haven't been done well, and I know we all have those stories or experiences probably. And so I think if we're hopeful that people can really grow fully, I think what we've said already is like the spiritual component is important and can be good, and it can also be significantly damaging as well.
There's a perspective too of people don't know what they don't know. And, coming at it with a posture of grace and collaboration. And, I think that's kind of where the GLC kind of sits anyway, in terms of a lot of our perspectives. We have a really strong ethical storytelling belief, principle guiding the organization. And as we do our own vetting process of, letting new people in or whatever, looking over their work and things, sometimes we'll see organizations where we're like, oh, that's really not a good way to do that. But you can really tell often that these are people that are just following what they've seen, and they haven't necessarily encountered ethical storytelling ideas before. And so, what we've seen over and over is if we give people access to education, information, good practices, colleagues that are doing things in an excellent way, they're like, oh, that's a much better way to do this. Let's do that. And so I think coming at it rather than like a naming and shaming, y'all shouldn't do that. I mean, there's probably some organizations that could use that, but I think overall really wanting to just be, hey, we don't want to exclude people of faith from the anti-trafficking world, but we want to make sure that the practices are good. Here's some good practices, developed by colleagues that are mostly in the faith-based space anyway, and just kind of calling people to higher standards with the expectation that most people actually really want to practice high standards. They just don't necessarily know what they are. And so I think a lot of it is just the perspective of offering education and tools. And I think even so far, the response that we've gotten is, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Like, we've been trying to figure out how to do this or how to communicate this, and this is a way to do it. It's not like I haven't heard people being offended by it at this point, because it's definitely more of a, here's a place at the table, and here's the expectations of the sector as a whole to do well, but let's help you get there.
Yeah.
I think the diversity of the team that built this guideline helps into that. It's create this sense of, oh, it's not coming from one country or one organization trying to force this value to other organization, but having this collaborative effort and having this document that's are not just titled from one organization. It's very helpful to then approach, even like for me, approaching my own colleagues in the office to see, hey, maybe we can sit down and reevaluate how we do things in Salvation Army with the help of these documents, and they're very open. We are trying to do that, and yeah, like Dalaina says, having that uh, place at the table to discuss this from not a very judging way is very helpful and very necessary.
As I'm listening to all of you, I'm reflecting. I'm currently working on a PhD in peace building, which has a large religious component as well, and a lot of these same tensions in terms of very well-meaning motivations, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of like deep care for people's experience. But if you're deeply into the religious space and haven't experienced harm, it's hard to see it as potentially being harmful. And so being able to at least have these conversations around the fact that it's possible, even when there's not the intent, I think is like unintentional harm is something I think that comes back a lot in this sector in terms of there's so many different perspectives, there's so many different experiences, there's so many different lived realities that people have faced that it's and part of the underlying problem in the sector is the people who've experienced all of these things generally are not comfortable sharing those experiences because of the effect sharing can have on the rest of their experience in terms of stigma, exclusion, all of those different things. And so you can, it's with the religious aspect, you can easily not know those backstories, those back details, and still unintentionally have an effect that you don't know you're having. And so having the guidelines to me seems like really an important, at least foundational level understanding of what's possible and what the playing field is, so that people can at least have open and honest conversations with the people in their programs, the people running their programs, the people funding their programs. That it seems really, really essential. Okay, so we've I think we've talked about that. My next question is, how did you ensure that these are relevant across different faiths, across different regions, sectors, not sectors so much, but regions, experiences? How did you incorporate the diversity of your authoring group into this document?
I mean, having a diversity of voices was one way. Just to include it, making sure that those people were included in the conversations.
Yeah, and we self-edited pretty hard, when it got into, this feels like it's more in like, Christian exclusive, we need to pull that back. There's been talk of having kind of using the guidelines and creating like a Christian theological defense of the principles. Somebody was really interested in potentially doing that, like on an academic level for seminary, because feeling like this is, from a Christian faith perspective, like something that is very much aligned with, how they could interpret the Bible or whatever, but it's not written in that way. It's very intentionally written broadly. And, I think continuing to go back and make sure it was not sounding like it was coming from just one perspective, but really try to stay really broad. And not everybody on the authoring committee was a person of faith, which was really helpful, so there was like, well, what about this? What about that? And people that were coming from non-Christian countries, who either who interacted a lot with people of non-Christian faith. So, I mean, like, we recognize that the dominant faith perspective in our sector, and as far as FBOs go, is Christian faith. Like, that's just true. But there's plenty of non-Christian faith-based orgs. And even if it's not organizational, there's people of all faiths that are working in the sector. So yeah, we're looking at an organizational kind of, like we're looking at organizations in this, not necessarily individuals. But I think it definitely can apply even as an individual practitioner of any faith as well, looking at my own personal practices, if I'm a caregiver or whatever.
Yeah, and you will see that throughout the document, in fact, there is no single reference to any specific religion. Everything is kept very generic on purpose, so that every organization that has a faith identity, regardless of what is the specific faith that identity is built around, can relate to those guidelines, can find them useful, and can feel that they speak to them. And also there was diversity not only in the authoring team, as Andrea and Dalaina already pointed out, but also in the smaller group of survivors that came in to give their feedback and went through the guidelines to make sure that their perspective was brought in.
Angela, anything to add?
No, I think they said it very well.
Okay. I just want to make sure I don't exclude anyone before I move on to another question. So I guess the next and final question on my list is, you've created the document. It's been released for a little while now. It's downloadable, I know, on Free the Slaves website, probably a number of other websites as well. What is the next steps for this? Is there any further follow-up to this, or are you providing training or having any more informational seminars or anything on this moving forward? What's the future plans for this?
I mean, Dalaina mentioned one, having maybe a more academic theological support for the document from a Christian perspective. I think also we talked about having some practicals or like questions or discussions or a guide to help people kind of work through the document and apply it in different contexts. Or some of the other things.
Yeah, we actually just kicked off yesterday our first, I guess, ethical guidelines working group number 2 to create an accompanying toolkit. Exactly what Andrea was saying, realizing this is really brief. It's something you can sit down to over lunch, but some of the feedback that we've gotten, and even just what we discussed before we even launched it, but the feedback we've gotten since then has been like, oh, this is great. It would be amazing to have case studies. It would be great to have some reflection questions, kind of templates for, different aspects of the document. Like, are we doing this well? Do we have good survivor participation? Are we making religious requirements that we shouldn't? So we've just started working on a toolkit to go with it, that organizations can kind of take and do self-assessments, and really look at their own policies and practices, or, use it as a staff development tool, or, training volunteers and staff, talking about having a policy around, religious practice, faith practices, if they're a faith-based organization, in terms of interactions with survivors. So we're just getting started on that. The other thing, the global learning community tends to be pretty open source. And so it's available on our website to anybody that wants to download it. It's been translated into Spanish. It's been translated into Indonesian. We are happy for anybody to take it and translate it into any language they like. We would like you to share it back so we can just link that up. But, I think there's some talk about getting it into some European languages as well. People that are really interested in that. So just wanting to make it accessible to people, easy to get, and, not necessarily looking at creating training program or anything ourselves, but happy for people to use it to develop something like that if they want.
Okay, excellent. I was actually, that was gonna be my follow-up question, was language availability, because I think that's something I've always seen across the sector. Is often you'll end up with, to a certain extent, leadership level people having access to English-based resources, but a lot of times it doesn't trickle down into, caseworkers or community organizing people, things like that. It's not available at their level in a way that they can access it. So I think that the fact that it's open and open source, and that you've already got some of those languages, is an amazing start for sure.
Yeah. And Angela and I we're actually getting ready to launch it into Indonesia, so already kind of making plans just with the anti-trafficking community that we know there, making sure it's getting in the hands of the right people, that they know it's there, just doing like a little launch webinar and sending it to different leaders, even churches that might have like a ministry that's, related to working with survivors or doing anti-trafficking prevention or something like that, so because it's not, yes, it's for organizations, but also we recognize there's a lot of anti-trafficking ministries underneath like church umbrellas or things like that. And so wanting to make sure it actually gets even further, even just than FBOs, because I think it is applicable to things like that as well.
Yeah, I think it's definitely applicable to any faith-based groups working with vulnerable populations. Yeah, I don't think it needs to be just the anti-trafficking sphere. That's just where it was born.
Right.
Yeah, and I know that also the member of the working group also kind of using these guidelines and communicating with their own organizations and spreading it within their own organizations. Me as well. And I want to jump on what Andrea said. Actually, one of my colleagues commented that this is applicable to any work with vulnerable communities. So not only when we're working with people, within this modern slavery sector, but also when we're working with children in general, when we're working with maybe a survivor of domestic violence, things like that. It is she mentioned that it is quite applicable for that also. Yeah.
Okay. That is all the questions that I had prepared. And I think I've got all of my follow-up questions in as well. So I guess to kind of close, I'll just open the floor if there's anything that I haven't asked that we need to talk about, or anything else you'd like to share in closing. We'll move to that, and then we can wrap up the episode here.
I mean, I think I would be failing at my job if I didn't mention that the global learning community is also open to members. Anybody that's working in this anti-trafficking space is welcome to join. I mean, we do stuff like this, collaborative projects, learning together. So if that's something that you're like, oh, this is cool, I would love to be a part of creating something like this, or working with colleagues on, a project that kind of benefits the whole movement, globallearning.community. There's a joining form. It's easy. It's free. We love to get, just people from all over doing all sorts of things so we can learn together as a movement. So definitely want to put a little shout out to the GLC as well.
Thank you for that,
I'll
Dalaina.
just support you in that.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, like, the GLC is awesome. They are such a strong network, really, where I think we make all of us better. Yeah.
I agree with that.
Dave, and I think I'm looking forward for more of these kind of collaborative projects to take place within the movement. I think it was a wonderful experience to be part of. I think the result is very important, and again, I'm looking forward to more of such projects that bring together different voices, diverse perspectives, and lead to outputs of this kind.
Well, awesome. Thank you guys so much for all sharing your experiences and your wisdom. I'll just highlight, like Dalaina said, globallearning.community. At the top of the website, there is a link for the resource hub, and at the top of the resource hub page is the Ethical Anti-Trafficking Practices Guide. So if you're looking for where to find it, that's the most prominent and easy to get to place. And you'll also find there that you can follow them on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So I think with that, we'll close the episode. And yeah, thank you all again for joining. It's been a really good learning experience.
Thank you, Bryon.
Thanks, Bryon.
Thank you, Bryon.
Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you hosting the conversation. Thank you.